The courtroom was silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rustle of papers. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat on the wooden bench, my hands clenched into fists. The judge, a stern woman with sharp features and glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, adjusted her robe and flipped through a thick stack of documents. On the other side of the room sat the Homeowners Association, HOA, board members, their arms crossed, their faces smug. Their lawyer, a man in a sharp gray suit named Richard Hargrove, stood beside them, his cold eyes darting toward me like I was some kind of criminal. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hargrove began, his voice smooth but laced with venom. "This man," he pointed at me dramatically, "has been living in our community, using our roads, benefiting from our infrastructure, yet he refuses to pay HOA dues. And why? Because he claims he's off-grid. But let me ask you, Your Honor, can a man who still drives on our streets and lives within our boundaries truly call himself separate?" I clenched my fists tighter. This was insane. I had built my homestead from the ground up. I used solar power, collected rainwater, and grew my own food. I didn't use their utilities, their SARE VYCES, or anything the HOA Pro VY did. Yet here I was, being sued like a common thief. The judge turned to me, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice calm but firm, "how do you respond to these accusations?" I took a deep breath, my palms sweaty. Before I could speak, Hargrove slammed another document onto the desk. "Your Honor," he said, his voice dripping with faux concern, "we are also seeking fines for the years of unpaid dues. And if Mr. Carter does not comply, we are requesting a lien on his property." A gasp ran through the courtroom. A lien. That meant they could take my home, my land. I felt the ground shift beneath me. How had it come to this? It all started 3 years ago when I bought a 5-acre plot of land on the outskirts of a small suburban neighborhood. It wasn't much at first, just a patch of dirt with some scattered trees, but I had a dream. I wanted to live simply, to be self-sufficient, and to prove that a person could live without being tied to corporations, electric companies, or government-controlled water supplies. I built my home with my own 2 hands, a small but sturdy log cabin. I installed solar panels, dug a well, and even built a greenhouse where I grew fresh vegetables year-round. No mortgage, no utility bills, just pure, unfiltered freedom. At first, nobody seemed to care. My land wasn't inside the HOA's neatly trimmed, cookie-cutter subdivision, and I figured that meant I was free from their rules. But then I started noticing the looks. People would drive by, slowing down as they passed my property, their eyes full of judgment. One day, a man in a navy suit knocked on my door. He introduced himself as Robert Clemens, the HOA president. He had that artificial smile, the kind that looked like it had been practiced in a mirror. "Mr. Carter," he said, adjusting his tie, "we've had some concerns from residents about your property." "Concerns?" I asked, crossing my arms. "Like what?" "Well," he said, glancing around, "you're not exactly within the HOA's community, but your land is still technically part of the original development zone. That means you fall under HOA jurisdiction." I laughed. "No, I don't. I don't use your water. I don't use your power grid. I don't even have trash pickup." He kept smiling. "That may be true, but you do use the roads to get to and from your property, don't you? And that means you're benefiting from HOA-maintained infrastructure." I shook my head. "I pay property taxes, same as everyone else. The county maintains those roads, not the HOA." His smile finally faded. "I'd hate for this to get messy, Mr. Carter. Just pay the dues, and we'll forget about all this." I shut the door in his face. That was my first mistake. Over the next few months, things got worse. I started getting letters in the mail, official-looking notices demanding that I pay hundreds of dollars in HOA fees. I ignored them. Then one day, I found a bright yellow notice nailed to my front gate. Violation, unauthorized structure. According to the HOA, my home was considered an unapproved dwelling because it didn't follow the neighborhood's architectural guidelines. The kicker? My land wasn't even inside their community. I tried to reason with them. I called the county office, and they confirmed that my land was outside the HOA zoning. But that didn't stop them. The harassment continued. Some mornings, I'd wake up to find my driveway blocked by HOA security vehicles. One time, I caught a man with a clipboard walking around my property, taking photos. Hey, I shouted, running toward him. What do you think you're doing? He didn't even flinch. Just documenting HOA violations, sir. You have no right to be on my land. He scribbled something down. That's not what the HOA says. That night, I sat on my porch, staring at the stars, wondering what to do. Then came the lawsuit. A thick envelope arrived at my doorstep, stamped with an official court seal. The HOA was suing me for unpaid dues, fines, and penalties. If I didn't pay up, they would place a lien on my property, which could eventually lead to foreclosure. I felt my stomach drop. They were trying to take my home. Back in the courtroom, I clenched my jaw as the judge flipped through the papers. Mr. Carter, she said, these are serious allegations. If the HOA's claims are valid, you could lose your property. My throat was dry. I could see the HOA members whispering among themselves, smirking like they had already won. The judge turned to their lawyer. Mr. Hargrove, do you have any further evidence to present? Yes, Your Honor, he said, his voice dripping with confidence. We have documentation proving that Mr. Carter has been in violation of HOA policy since the day he moved in. I felt my world closing in. And then, just as I opened my mouth to speak, the doors to the courtroom burst open. A man rushed in, out of breath, clutching a stack of documents. Your Honor, he called out, I have new evidence that changes everything. The entire room turned toward him. I had no idea who he was, but from the look on the HOA board members' faces, they did. The man who had just burst through the doors was tall, dressed in a rumpled button-down shirt with sleeves rolled up, like he had just come from a long day at work. He clutched a stack of papers so tightly that his knuckles were turning white. Your Honor, he said again, his voice steady. This lawsuit is based on false claims. The judge raised an eyebrow. And who are you? The man took a deep breath. My name is Daniel Reed. I'm a county zoning officer. Hargrove, the HOA lawyer, immediately shot up from his seat. Objection, Your Honor. This man was not listed as a witness, and this is highly irregular. The judge held up a hand. I'll allow it, but this better be good. She gestured for Daniel to approach the bench. Mr. Reed, she said, what exactly are you here to present? Daniel stepped forward, handing the judge a thick packet of documents. These are zoning records from the county archives. They prove that Mr. Carter's property was never part of the HOA's jurisdiction. A collective murmur spread through the room. The HOA board members shifted in their seats, their smug expressions replaced with uncertainty. The judge flipped through the documents, scanning them carefully. Then she turned to Hargrove. Mr. Hargrove, what do you have to say about this? Hargrove cleared his throat, trying to regain control. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. Even if Mr. Carter's property was not originally part of the HOA, he still uses roads and infrastructure maintained by the association. Daniel shook his head. That's not true. The county maintains those roads, not the HOA. And if you check page 5 of the documents I provide, you'll see that Mr. Carter's property was legally excluded from HOA governance years ago when the original developer changed the zoning plans. The judge flipped to page 5. The courtroom was dead silent. I could see sweat forming on Hargrove's forehead. The HOA board members looked like they had swallowed something sour. The judge sighed, then turned to me. Mr. Carter, please step forward. I stood up, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. The judge looked me in the eye. From what I'm seeing here, the HOA's case is built on shaky ground. However, I need to review these documents thoroughly before making a ruling. I nodded. Understood, Your Honor. But just when I thought things were turning in my favor, Hargrove pulled out another card. Your Honor, he said smoothly, while we wait for your ruling, I'd like to bring up another issue. The judge sighed. Go ahead. Hargrove turned to me with a cold smile. Mr. Carter has also been in violation of county safety regulations. His off-grid homestead lacks proper sewage infrastructure, and he is collecting rainwater without a permit. Not only is this illegal, but it poses a health hazard to the surrounding community. I clenched my fist. That's a lie. My composting system is legal, and my rainwater collection follows all regulations. Hargrove shook his head. We have photographic evidence of standing water on Mr. Carter's property, which could attract disease-carrying mosquitoes. We also have records that show he never applied for the proper homestead permits. If the court allows, we'd like to file an injunction requiring Mr. Carter to vacate the property until these health violations are addressed. A shocked gasp rippled through the courtroom. I felt my breath hitch. This wasn't just about HOA fees anymore. Now they were trying to make me homeless. 3 years earlier, when I first moved onto the land, I knew it wasn't going to be easy. But I had never imagined something like this. I had always dreamed of levying off the grid. Growing up, my grandfather used to tell me stories about the old days, how people used to serve VYV without relying on power companies or supermarkets. A man should know how to take care of himself, he'd always say. If you can grow your own food and make your own shelter, you'll never be at the mercy of anyone. That stuck with me. So when I finally had the chance to buy my land, I didn't hesitate. I spent months clearing out the space, chopping wood, and building my home from scratch. I learned how to filter water, how to grow crops, and how to live with nature instead of against it. Neighbors from the HOA community would sometimes drive by, watching me like I was some kind of alien. They lived in houses that all looked the same, perfectly painted, with identical mailboxes and neatly trimmed hedges. I could tell that my little wooden cabin, with its solar panels and vegetable garden, didn't fit into their idea of what normal looked like. I tried to be friendly. I waved when I saw them. I even offered to share some of my fresh produce with a couple who lived nearby. But most of them just ignored me, or worse, they called the HOA. That's when the letters started. The first one was just a friendly notice, reminding me that I was expected to comply with neighborhood standards. The second one was less friendly. It listed all the violations I was supposedly committing: unapproved dwelling structure, unauthorized rainwater collection, failure to maintain proper landscaping. I crumpled it up and tossed it into the fireplace. Then one night, I woke up to the sound of an engine outside my cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and peered through the window. A black SUV was parked just beyond my fence. Someone was out there. I stepped onto my porch, shining my light into the darkness. "Who's there?" No answer. The SUV's engine revved, and the vehicle sped off, kicking up dust as it disappeared down the road. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just about HOA rules. This was personal. Back in the courtroom, the judge rubbed her temples. "Mr. Hargrove, these are serious allegations. Do you have proof?" Hargrove smirked. "We do, Your Honor." He handed over a folder. Photographic evidence, as well as county records showing that Mr. Carter never obtained proper permits for his homestead. I gritted my teeth. I knew this was a setup. The judge flipped through the documents. Then she turned to Daniel Reed, the zoning officer. "Mr. Reed, can you confirm the validity of these claims?" Daniel took the folder and scanned through the photos. Then his brows furrowed. "These are misleading," he said. "This image of standing water could have been taken after a rainstorm. And as for the permits," he flipped to another page. "It looks like there was an application for homestead permits, but it was never processed due to a clerical error at the county office." Hargrove's smirk faltered. The judge exhaled. "So you're saying these supposed violations may not be violations at all?" "Exactly," Daniel confirmed. "And if the county failed to process Mr. Carter's permits properly, then the responsibility is on the county, not him." A wave of murmurs spread through the courtroom. I could see the panic on the HOA board members' faces. Their entire case was starting to fall apart. But just when I thought I was in the clear, Hargrove straightened his tie and said, "In that case, Your Honor, we have one final piece of evidence." He turned toward me, a twisted grin on his face. "We have a witness who claims Mr. Carter has been illegally trespassing on HOA property." I felt my stomach drop. "What?" I snapped. "That's a lie." Hargrove gestured toward the back of the courtroom. "Then let's hear from someone who says otherwise." The doors swung open, and in walked the last person I ever expected to see. The doors swung open, and my breath caught in my throat. Walking into the courtroom, dressed in a neatly pressed suit, was DVYD Montgomery, one of my old neighbors. My stomach twisted. DVYD was one of the few people from the HOA community I had ever been friendly with. He wasn't like the rest of them. He'd stopped by my homestead a few times, even complimented my setup. We had talked about gardening, self-sufficiency, and how ridiculous HOA rules could be. I had trusted him. And now here he was, walking to the witness stand like he was about to betray me. He didn't look at me as he raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth. The judge turned to Hargrove. Proceed. Hargrove adjusted his tie, wearing a triumphant grin. Mr. Montgomery, can you confirm for the court that you have seen Mr. Carter trespassing on HOA property? The VYD hesitated. Something flickered in his eyes. Then he sighed. Yes. A ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom. I shot to my feet. That's a lie. The judge banged her gavel. Mr. Carter, sit down, or you'll be held in contempt. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to sit. My blood was boiling. Hargrove continued, turning back to the VYD. Please describe what you saw. The VYD shifted uncomfortably. There were a few times I saw Carter using the HOA-maintained roads to drive through the neighborhood. And there was one night I saw him near the community clubhouse. I don't know what he was doing, but he was on HOA property. I stared at him in disbelief. The VYD, you know that's not true. He finally met my eyes, and for the first time, I realized something looked guilty. This wasn't just some random lie. Something or someone had pushed him into doing this. Hargrove smirked. Your Honor, as you can see, Mr. Carter has repeatedly violated HOA property rights. He may claim to be off-grid, but he still benefits from our roads, our infrastructure, and, based on this witness testimony, our private property. The judge frowned. Mr. Montgomery, do you have any proof of these claims? Photographs? Video footage? The VYD swallowed. No, ma'am. Just my word. The judge sighed, rubbing her temples. All right, I'll take this testimony into consideration, but without hard evidence, it's not enough to make a ruling. For the first time, I felt a small sliver of hope. But then Hargrove pulled out his final weapon. In that case, Your Honor, he said, the HOA would like to present surveillance footage of Mr. Carter trespassing on community property. My heart stopped. Hargrove nodded to someone in the audience, and a man in a dark blazer walked up, handing the judge a USB drive. The judge inserted it into the courtroom's projector. The screen flickered to life, and then the video began. 3 years ago, when I first started building my homestead, I had no idea the HOA would become my enemy. In those early days, I was too focused on survival to care about neighborhood politics. I spent my mornings clearing land, my afternoons building my cabin, and my nights reading old survival manuals by the light of my solar lantern. One of the biggest challenges was water. I had installed a rainwater collection system, but it wasn't enough. So sometimes, in the dead of night, I drove into town to fill up extra water tanks from a public source. It was exhausting work. One night, my truck broke down on my way home. I was about a mile away from my property, stranded on the side of the road, and unfortunately, that road cut through the HOA's neighborhood. I had no choice. I left my truck and started walking home, cutting through the back of the neighborhood. That was the night I met the VYD Montgomery. I had been passing by the community clubhouse when I saw movement on the porch. The VYD had been sitting there, drinking from a flask. Carter, he had called out, surprised. What are you doing here? I had sighed, too tired to argue. Truck broke down. Just cutting through. The VYD had chuckled. Man, you're crazy. The HOA board already thinks you're a troublemaker. I had shaken my head. I don't care what they think. The VYD had taken a long sip from his flask. They're going to make your life hell, you know. I had frowned. Why? He had smirked. Because you're free. I had stared at him, confused. The VYD had sighed, leaning back in his chair. Look, I don't agree with the HOA's nonsense, but people in this neighborhood, they don't like feeling different. They like their little rules, their neat little houses. You don't fit in, and that scares them. I had watched him carefully. And what about you? He had chuckled. I don't mind you, Carter. You remind me of my grandpa. He used to live off the land, too. I had relaxed slightly. That night, I had thought I had made a friend. But now, as I watched a VYD sit on that witness stand, lying to the court, I realized I had been wrong. The courtroom was silent as the VYD played. The footage was grainy, taken from a security camera near the clubhouse. It showed a dark figure walking through the neighborhood late at night. I watched as I walked past the clubhouse, my shoulders hunched, my steps quick. It looked bad. Really bad. Hargrove smiled. As you can see, Your Honor, this proves Mr. Carter has been trespassing on HOA property. I gritted my teeth. That footage doesn't prove anything. My truck broke down. I was just trying to get home. The judge turned to me. Mr. Carter, is this true? Yes, I said firmly. And DVYD Montgomery knew that. He was there that night. The entire courtroom turned to DVYD. His face went pale. Hargrove's expression darkened. Mr. Montgomery, is that true? DVYD opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at me, then at the HOA board, then back at me. For a long moment, he didn't speak. And then, finally, in a barely audible whisper, he said, yes. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Hargrove spun on his heel. You told us Carter was trespassing. I lied, DVYD admitted, his voice shaky. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just trying to get home. The court exploded into whispers. The judge banged her gavel. Order. I exhaled sharply, my chest tight. DVYD had just blown a hole in the HOA's case. But before I could even feel relief, Hargrove slammed his hands on the table. Fine, he said, his voice dripping with venom. Maybe that footage isn't enough to prove trespassing, but I do have proof of something else. He turned to the judge. We have financial records showing that Mr. Carter never paid property taxes. The air left my lungs. What? The judge frowned. Mr. Carter, is this true? No, I said quickly. I've paid my taxes every year. Hargrove pulled out another folder. Then explain this. He handed it to the judge. She opened it, her eyes narrowed. My hands trembled as I watched her expression change. And then she looked at me. Mr. Carter, she said slowly. According to these records, the county has no record of you owning your land. The room spun. What? I whispered. Hargrove grinned. Mr. Carter, he said, his voice triumphant. You don't legally own your homestead. I felt the walls closing in. The HOA wasn't just trying to find meth, they were trying to erase me. And if they were right, I was about to lose everything. The judge's words echoed in my ears. Mr. Carter, according to these records, the county has no record of you owning your land. I felt the breath leave my lungs. The walls of the courtroom seemed to close in on me. This wasn't just about HOA dues anymore. This was about my home, the place I had built with my own hands, the land I had worked for, the life I had carved out for myself. And now they were telling me it wasn't mine. Hargrove smirked like a wolf that had just cornered its prey. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, without legal ownership of his land, Mr. Carter has no legal right to refuse HOA membership. In fact, he may not even have the right to remain on the property at all. I shot to my feet. That's a lie. The judge banged her gavel. Sit down, Mr. Carter. I barely heard her. My hands clenched into fists as I turned to Daniel Reed, the zoning officer who had tried to help me earlier. Daniel, I said, my voice raw. Tell them this is a mistake. Daniel was already flipping through his documents, his face tight with concentration. Something's not right, he muttered under his breath. But Hargrove wasn't done. We have proof, he said, holding up a thick stack of papers. These county records clearly show that Mr. Carter's land was never properly registered. If anything, it should revert to the HOA's control under community development laws. I felt like I was drowning. Your Honor, Hargrove continued smoothly. We request immediate action. At the very least, an injunction preventing Mr. Carter from making any further modifications to the property while this is resolved. The judge looked at the documents, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to me. Mr. Carter, she said, do you have proof that you own your land? My mouth was dry. Yes, I said. I have the deed. I bought it fair and square. Hargrove folded his arms. Then where is it? I opened my mouth, then froze. Where was it? I had the deed. I remembered signing the papers, going through the whole legal process, but where had I put the actual document? It had been years since I needed it. Panic swirled in my chest. It's at my cabin, I said quickly. I can get it. Hargrove scoffed. Convenient. I turned back to Daniel. Tell them this is wrong. You know my land was never part of the HOA. Daniel's eyes flicked up from the documents, and I saw something shift in his expression. I need to check something, he said suddenly. He grabbed his phone and stood up. Your Honor, I request a brief recess to verify these claims. The judge considered for a moment, then nodded. Recess granted. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes. I stepped out into the courthouse hallway, my heart pounding. Daniel was already on his phone, speaking rapidly with someone from the county office. I took a deep breath, trying to clear my head. Then I felt a presence next to me. I turned. DVYD Montgomery was standing there. I clenched my jaw. Why'd you lie? DVYD exhaled, running a hand through his graying hair. I didn't have a choice. I narrowed my eyes. Everyone has a choice. He looked away, shame flickering across his face. You don't understand, Carter. The HOA. They have more power than you think. I scoffed. Yeah, I'm figuring that out. DVYD sighed. They threatened me. Said if I didn't testify against you, they'd come after me next. Said they'd find me into the ground over some violations they suddenly discovered on my property. I stared at him. He wouldn't meet my eyes. They control everything in that neighborhood, he muttered. People don't fight them. They can't. I clenched my fist. That was exactly why I had chosen to live off-grid to be free of people like them. And now they were trying to take that freedom away. I took a step closer. Are you willing to tell the truth now? DVYD swallowed. Then he nodded. Yeah. Before I could say anything else, Daniel came rushing back down the hallway. His face was pale. Carter, he said, breathless, we have a huge problem. 15 minutes later, we were back in the courtroom. The judge tapped her gavel. Mr. Reed, do you have an update? Daniel nodded, but he looked shaken. Your Honor, he said carefully, I spoke to the county records office. It appears that someone altered the records. A murmur spread through the courtroom. What do you mean, altered? The judge asked. Daniel took a breath. The original land deed existed, but at some point, it was removed from the public record. It was replaced with documentation that falsely suggests the land was never properly registered. The room fell silent. The judge's eyes darkened. Are you saying this was done intentionally? Daniel nodded. Yes. Someone at the county office deliberately erased Mr. Carter's ownership from the records. A gasp ran through the courtroom. I gripped the edge of the table. They had tried to erase me to make it look like I never existed. I turned to Hargrove. His face had gone stiff, but I saw the flicker of panic in his eyes. He knew. The judge frowned. Mr. Reed, do you have proof of who altered these records? Daniel hesitated. Not yet, but I requested a forensic audit. If we dig deeper, we can find out exactly who did it. Hargrove shot to his feet. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. No, the judge said sharply. This is highly relevant. She turned to me. Mr. Carter, do you have the original deed? I exhaled. It's at my cabin. The judge nodded. Then I will allow a one-day recess for Mr. Carter to retrieve his deed. If he can prove it, and if Mr. Reed's audit confirms foul play, we may be looking at criminal misconduct. A stunned silence followed. Hargrove's face turned red. The HOA board members looked like they had just swallowed a lemon. I stared at them, feeling something shift inside me. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was winning. But I wasn't celebrating yet. Because as I stood there, I saw the way Hargrove's jaw tightened, the way he leaned toward one of the HOA board members, whispering urgently. And I knew they weren't going to give up that easily. They had already erased my records. What would they do next? As I walked out of the courtroom, heading toward my truck to retrieve my deed, one thought kept repeating in my head. I need to get home before they do. I drove faster than I ever had before. The courthouse was nearly an hour away from my homestead, but I pushed my truck hard, gripping the wheels so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind raced. Someone had erased my land records. The HOA had tried to make me disappear on paper. And now that the judge was on to them, I had no doubt they'd do something worse. I just had to get home, get my deed, get back to court, and finally end this. But as I turned down the dirt road leading to my property, my stomach twisted. Something was wrong. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. The trees swayed gently in the evening breeze. The wooden fence that marked my land still stood. The cabin was just as I had left it. But then I noticed my front door was wide open. And I knew I had locked it before Leah vying for court. A cold dread settled in my gut. I parked the truck, jumping out before the engine had fully died. I rushed up the steps of the porch, heart pounding. Inside, my cabin was wrecked. Drawers were pulled open, their contents dumped onto the floor. My bookshelf had been overturned. The table in the kitchen was flipped. Someone had torn through my home, searching for something. My deed. I sprinted to the small wooden chest where I kept all my important documents. The lock had been broken clean off, and inside empty. They had taken it. I stood there, breathing hard, my entire body shaking. For the first time in this fight, I felt real fear. The HOA wasn't just playing dirty, they were desperate. And desperate people did dangerous things. I clenched my fist. They thought this was over without the deed. I had nothing. But they were wrong. They had just made their biggest mistake. Because now, I wasn't just defending my home. I was coming for them. I didn't go back to the courthouse that night. Instead, I made a stop in town. There was one person I needed to see. The next morning, I walked back into the courtroom with a different kind of confidence. I didn't have the deed, but I had something better. As I stepped inside, all eyes turned to me. The judge looked expectant. Hargrove smirked, thinking he had won. And behind him, the HOA board members sat with stiff expressions, waiting for the final nail in my coffin. The judge tapped her gavel. "Mr. Carter, do you have your deed?" I took a deep breath. "No, Your Honor." Hargrove's smirk widened. "Then I believe this case is over." "Not quite," I said. "Because I have a witness." The judge frowned. "A witness?" The doors swung open, and in walked Sheriff Tom Grayson. The entire courtroom shifted. Sheriff Grayson was a respected manha, had been surveying the county for over 20 years, and he didn't take sides. He only cared about the law. He walked straight to the witness stand, tipped his hat to the judge, and swore in. The judge turned to me. "Mr. Carter, explain." I nodded. "Last night, while I was on my way to retrieve my deed, my home was broken into." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Hargrove stiffened. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Continue." I took a step forward. "Whoever broke in wasn't looking for valuables. They didn't take my tools, my SAVYNGS, or my supplies. They only took one thing." I turned, locking eyes with Hargrove. "My deed." Gasps spread through the courtroom. Hargrove's face paled. The judge turned to Sheriff Grayson. "Do you have proof of this break-in?" Sheriff Grayson nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I personally went out to Mr. Carter's homestead this morning. The door was forced open, and the place was ransacked. The lock on his document chest was broken." The judge turned back to me. "Mr. Carter, do you have reason to believe someone connected to this case was involved?" I exhaled. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe the HOA board is behind this." Hargrove shot up. "Objection. That's an outrageous claim." Sheriff Grayson cut him off. "Actually, Mr. Hargrove, I got something else to add." Everyone turned to him. "I checked security cameras from the nearest gas station last night," the sheriff said, his tone sharp. "Guess what I saw?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a printed photo. He held it up. The entire courtroom gasped. Because clear as day, standing outside a black SUV parked near my homestead, was Robert Clements. Hargrove's face drained of color. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Clements, do you have an explanation for this?" Clements stammered. I was just..." Sheriff Grayson cut him off. "Save it. We're already opening an investigation into tampering with county records and breaking and entering." Silence. Then the judge's gavel slammed. "This case is no longer about HOA dues. It appears we have a case of fraud, trespassing, and conspiracy." She turned to me. "Mr. Carter, I am dismissing all claims against you, effective immediately. The HOA has no right to demand dues from you, nor any control over your property." I exhaled sharply. It was over. The judge turned to Sheriff Grayson. "Please proceed with the investigation." Sheriff Grayson tipped his hat. "With pleasure." As the gavel slammed one final time, Hargrove collapsed into his chair, defeated. And I stood there, feeling something I hadn't felt in months' freedom. As I stepped outside, DVYD Montgomery caught up to me. "Carter," he said, shifting uncomfortably. I'm sorry. I studied him." He looked genuinely ashamed. I nodded. "I know." He hesitated. "What happens now?" I took a deep breath, looking out at the horizon. "I go home." DVYD smiled faintly. "You really did it." I chuckled. "Yeah, I did." I climbed into my truck, the sun shining down on me, and drove back to my Lammy home. The HOA had tried to erase me. They had tried to break me. But in the end, I had won. And as I pulled up to my cabin, I knew one thing for certain. I would never let anyone take my freedom away again. If you were the one in this story, how would you react? Would you stand up and fight back, or accept the unreasonable pressure and control from the HOA? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video with more people. Your small action gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more intense and engaging stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.